So we have talked so far in a greater detail on what is called electron microscopy and particularly transmission electron microscopy, and looked at what a transmission electron microscopy can do. We said that transmission electron microscopy is a microscope that can show you very fine details in the material, and we said this particular microscope can show you microstructural features which are, for example, let's say precipitates inside. And in this context, we need to understand there are three imaging modes in which the TEM is usually used. One is called a bright field, another is called a dark field, and third one is called phase contrast. In a bright field, what we do is, if I have a sample through which an electron beam is going through, there is a transmitted beam, there is a diffracted beam. And this is the screen on which they are all falling. And if I look at this Rangoli, once again, you see something like this, let's say. Now what we have is, there are two apertures. In apertures are nothing but certain rings, okay, with a certain hole in it. And we use in a TEM two apertures. One is called selected area aperture, another is called objective aperture. Okay, that means in the path of the beam, there are certain apertures kept, okay, which are basically one which is selected area aperture, another which is called an objective aperture. Objective aperture obviously will not be on top, objective aperture will be at the bottom, and the selected area aperture will be on the top. Okay, so you have an objective aperture. So what we do is, selected area aperture is used to select an area from which I want to get the diffraction pattern. For example, I have a aluminum copper alloy, which is an age hardened alloy. I have some theta double prime precipitates inside an aluminum matrix. I want to get diffraction pattern only from the theta double prime. So what I can do is, I can choose this particular microstructure. I look at the microstructure, have these particles, and put my aperture around this particle. And when I put the aperture around this particle, then only the diffraction that comes from this particle alone will be reflected on the diffraction pattern. And the rest of the region, you are cutting it off. Okay, so that diffraction that is coming from the remaining region is not visualized on the photosensitive screen, and you will be only getting the diffraction pattern from this. Similarly, if I want to get a diffraction pattern from the matrix, I can put the aperture on the matrix and get a diffraction pattern only from the matrix. This feature is not available in X-ray diffraction, because X-ray diffraction is a bulk technique. I cannot select an area and do a diffraction. So that is one of the special features of a electron diffraction, that you can select a small sample. And instead of selecting only the matrix and only the precipitate, if I select, if this is, instead of to make life simpler, let us put my precipitates as disc type precipitates. Because my aperture is circular, so you may be getting confused between the aperture and the precipitate. And we know typically that in an aluminum copper alloy, all the precipitates are disc shaped. Have you heard of this? Okay. There are some special alloys where the precipitates are spherical in nature. Anybody knows any age hardened alloy where you get spherical precipitates? Which one? Of course, incoherent can be spherical, need not be spherical, fine. But there are some coherent precipitates which are spherical. Certain alloy systems. Which are those? Anybody knows? One standard example is Ni3Al. The reason is, Ni3Al, the crystal structure is exactly same as the matrix. Matrix is FCC. Ni3Al is also FCC. The lattice parameter of Ni3Al and the lattice parameter of nickel is exactly similar, very, very, very close. And as a result, the misfit, the delta parameter we were talking about in one of the class, is close to 0. In such a case, there is no strain at all. The coherency strains that we talk about, in order to maintain the coherency between the precipitate and the matrix, is very small. As a result, the precipitate would like to take a spherical shape, because the spherical shape is the one which has the lowest surface energy. Among various shapes, you might have known by now that sphere is the one which has the lowest surface area per unit value. Okay, so given a chance, every precipitate wants to be spherical, because by becoming a spherical, it will have the lowest surface energy. But the problem is the sphere may not have the lowest strain energy, because in a solid state precipitation, you need to bother both about surface energy and strain energy. So the system will choose such a shape of the precipitate which will have a lower combination of both. It wants to minimize the combination of these two energies should be minimized. If the surface, if the strain energy between the particle and the matrix is very small, when will it be very small? When the misfit is very small, then the strain energy is very small, and when the strain energy is very small, then automatically the precipitate will be spherical. But if the misfit is very large, then the system will try to choose that particular precipitate shape which will have a minimum strain energy, and that one is the disk. Disk is the one where on both sides the lattice matching will be very easy. Spherical is the one where you have a curved surface. When you have a curved surface, maintaining the lattice matching or across a curved surface is not easy. So as a result, the strain for a spherical precipitate is always highest. You can plot the strain energy as a function of shape of the precipitate. You will see it will be the highest for sphere, lowest for the disk, and that is the reason why you get disk. So if you take a disk precipitate, now I can put my aperture here, or I can put my aperture here. If I put my aperture here, I will get the crystal structure of the matrix. If I put my aperture here, I will get the crystal structure of the thing. Instead, if I put my aperture here, or something like covering both of them, then what do I get? I get now a composite diffraction pattern. I get a diffraction pattern from the precipitate also, I get a diffraction pattern from the matrix also. And if I look at this composite diffraction pattern, you will see that there will be some spots, diffraction spots of the precipitate diffraction pattern matching exactly with a particular diffraction spot of the matrix. So that particular diffraction spot, if I look at where there is exactly overlapping of the diffraction spot of the matrix diffraction pattern and the precipitate diffraction pattern, and that particular overlapping diffraction spot, if I can find out what is the HKL of it, and then I can say that so and so H1 K1 L1 of the precipitate is parallel to so and so H1 K1 L1 of the matrix. If they are only parallel, then only they will exactly fall at the same space, right? Only when these two are parallel. Otherwise, they will not fall at the same spot, because this spot means a certain distance, certain despacing, and certain angle. Okay? If two spots are falling at the same space, same place, that means their despacings must be equal, okay, and their angles must be equal. And this is what you can see. And generally, if you look at Ni3Al and nickel matrix, for example, you can see that the 111 plane of the Ni and the 111 plane of the Ni3Al will always be parallel to each other. That is what is called coherency. You will be able to see that you will have two sets of diffraction patterns which may have slightly different things, but one of them spot will match exactly with each other. And so you will see that you may have another set. So, for example, if I say You may see another, maybe I should use a different color. Another pattern which is at an angle with respect to this pattern. But out of these spots, one of the spots or some of the spots will overlap with each other. And if I look at only those spots where the black and red dots are overlapping with each other, and that indicates what that a particular HKL plane of the nickel and another HKL plane of the Ni3Al are matching. And to find out what are those HKLs, what should I do? I should index this pattern and I should also index this pattern separately. If I index these two patterns separately, then I will get one HKL when I am indexing this pattern. This pattern may be belonging to nickel. This pattern may be belonging to Ni3Al. And I index these two separately. And then find out which are those parts which are matching. And from this I can find out the orientation relationships, which I will not be able to do it from X-ray diffraction. So you can actually do this by selecting a particular aperture. So that's why we call it as selected area aperture. And this diffraction pattern is called selected area diffraction pattern, SAD. So you are selecting a particular area and getting a diffraction pattern. And now what we are talking about is what is this bright field, what is this dark field. Now once I have a diffraction pattern, let us say I have this, let me not bother about orientation relationship. I have a diffraction pattern something like this. After the diffraction pattern is obtained by selecting a particular region, I have selected a particular region, got the diffraction pattern. After getting the diffraction pattern, if I choose this objective aperture and place it around the transmitted spot and get the image of the sample, the image that I see, I am now not looking at the diffraction pattern, but I am seeing the actual image. The image will look like the whole background will be bright and the precipitates which are giving the diffraction will be black in color. Because why I am saying? Because I am not choosing the diffracted spots, I am only choosing the transmitted beam. I have left out all the diffracted spots, and that means the diffracted beams are not being collected in forming the image, and only the transmitted beam is being collected to form the image. As a result, wherever diffraction is taking place, all that looks black and the transmitted beam alone is bright. As a result, you will have a bright background and all the precipitates will look dark. Whichever precipitates are giving diffraction pattern. If there are some precipitates which are not giving, which are oriented in such a condition that they are not giving any diffraction, they may look bright. But those particular precipitates which are all contributing to these diffracted spots will all look black, because they are not covered in that. Instead of doing this, if I can select any one of these diffracted spots and put my objective aperture there, there are two ways of doing that. One is I can move the objective aperture and bring it to that diffracted spot and get the image from the diffracted spot. The second possibility is move the diffracted spot to the center. There is an optical axis, okay, to this whole diffraction pattern. There is a center for the optical axis. I can move my diffraction pattern, and there are ways of doing that in TEM, and I can move that and bring the diffracted part to the center, and this is what is called centered dark field image. And if I do this centered dark field image, or bringing this here or moving that thing there, one of these two can be done. There are advantages of moving this. I will not go into the details of that, but if you do that, what I get is all those precipitates which are giving diffraction, this way in which this particular plane is getting diffracted, they alone will look bright. Rest are all looks black. So you will have a black background, and in which the precipitates only will be shining like white particles. Not all precipitates, but only those precipitates which are whose surfaces, whose plane which is exposed to the surface is such that it is giving this plane plane is giving diffraction pattern. Because there are so many precipitates, out of all of them, if I am considering my sample is a planar sample, right? In this planar sample, if I look at these precipitates, some of them may be at an angle, some of them may be parallel to the surface, and the planes which are parallel to this particular surface, which are giving the diffraction pattern, those precipitates alone will look bright, rest of them will be dark. So the ones which are giving this, the precipitates in which this particular plane is active and getting diffracted is the one which will look black. And this is how we can talk about bright field and dark field. There are certain advantages of this. For example, particularly nanomaterials. If your goal is to find out what is the grain size of a nanomaterial, the best way is to go to a dark field diffraction, because you will know which are the grains which are actually giving diffraction. If you have a sample with so many grains in it, and you are putting your objective aperture after taking the diffraction pattern, I will also come to it a little later. How does a nanomaterial will give you a diffraction pattern? Maybe now that we are talking, maybe we will finish that part also. For example, this particular diffraction pattern that we talk about is called single crystal diffraction pattern. Why? Because it is coming from one single grain. Okay, that means my selected area aperture is chosen in such a way that it is kept inside one single grain, so that only one grain is giving me the diffraction. If I have more grains giving diffraction, that means I have a material with some grain size like this, and instead of putting my aperture like this, so that only one grain gives me diffraction, I put my aperture like this, selected area aperture. That means this grain 1, grain 2, grain 3, all of them are giving diffraction. And the diffraction patterns from all of them are being collected, and then you are able to see. That means you will now get a diffraction pattern which is a composite diffraction pattern coming from all the 3 grains. And what is the difference between each of these grains? The difference between each is what? Is the orientation difference. Right? That's what we say. That means if I am taking a particular plane called 111 plane, if the 111 plane here is parallel to the surface, the 111 plane here is at a certain angle to the surface. The 111 plane in grain 2 also is possibly at certain other angle. That is the only difference. So if I consider that in one of the grain, the 111 planes are just parallel to this top surface, the other 2 grains are such that they are at an angle. But the D spacings for this 111 plane, whether it is grain 1 or grain 2 or grain 3, it is all the same. Why? Because D spacing depends not on the orientation, but it depends only on the A and the HKL. Because D equal to A divided by H square plus K square plus L square. So if the D spacing is fixed for a particular HKL, whether it is grain 1 or grain 2 or grain 3, if D is fixed, then R is fixed. Why? Because RD equal to L lambda. Right? Just now we have derived in one of the previous classes. So if that is the case, if the D for a particular HKL is fixed for all these 3 grains, then the R is fixed. Then what is the difference? How does that composite pattern look like? For example, if I am choosing one particular plane called 100 plane or 010 plane, let us say. If one of the grain is giving a 010 diffraction spot at this point, 010, sorry, I wanted to write it as 010. Okay. If one of the grain is giving a diffraction pattern at this, the second grain should give its 010 at a particular spot which is at equal distance from the central spot. Because R has to be the same, because D is the same for grain 1 and grain 2. So if I draw a circle, with equal radius, my 010 of grain 2 will fall on this circle somewhere. So it may be somewhere here. Depending on how much of orientation difference it has, okay, it will be either closer or farther, depending on the orientation difference. But it will definitely fall on that circle because the R has to be same because D is same. So you will get one more pattern where the whole pattern is tilted kind of at a certain angle. Similarly, grain 3 will also fall on the same circle. Grain 3, 0, 1, 0 will also fall on the same circle with a different angle. This is how you can actually get a composite diffraction pattern. And now if I have a large number of grains coming inside my what is called the selected area aperture. Usually selected area apertures, the smallest selected area aperture, usually in a TEM we use 3 selected area apertures with different diameters. The smallest is of the order of 1 micron. If I am working on a material with about 10 nanometer grain size, then in this 1 micron, how many I can expect grains of 10 nanometer? 1 micron is how many nanometers? How many? 1000 nanometers. Right? So if my grain size is 10 nanometer and I have a selected area aperture whose diameter is 1 micron and I have grains which are all inside this particular selected area aperture whose grain diameter is about 10 nanometer. Can you roughly estimate and tell me how many such grains will be there? No? Metallurgists are supposed to be bad in mathematics, right? No? Easy mathematics. Can just tell me. You have grains which have 10 nanometer diameter. I'm only asking you roughly. Do not exactly calculate, sir, 4 pi, 2 pi r square and then divide pi r square with that pi r square. Just give me some rough number. Or if I can say, maybe it may be easier for you. If I assume this to be square with about 1 micron, and if I assume that these grains are square with about 10 nanometer, now tell me. How many grains I can expect? This is much easier. I am taking a square and the grains are also square, let us say. 10, only 10, 10 power 4, right? It is 10 power 4 because in one direction I will have 1 micron by 10, that is about 100, 1000 by 10. And in another direction I will have again 100. It is 100 into 100. It is 10,000 grains will be there. And if I have 10,000 grains, then what happens is this particular, all these grains have different orientations. As a result, what you see is all these grains have that 1010 spots of each of these grains will fall on this particular circle in such a way that this 010 will look like a circle with a transmitted spot here. So the whole diffraction pattern now will be simply nothing but circles. And these circles, depending on what is the crystal structure of that particular thing, if the crystal structure of these nanoparticles is FCC, then you will see the first ring will be 111, second ring will be 200, third ring will be 220, and fourth ring will be 311. Like an XRD pattern with the peaks, you will get these rings. That is because a large number of grains are all trying to simultaneously give me diffraction pattern, and they are all falling on this circle because they all should have the same D spacing, and they all should have the same R because the R is inversely proportional to D. And you can see the R of 200 will be larger than the R of 111. Why? Because the D of 200 is smaller. So I will simply get these rings, and by measuring these R's, I can find out what are the D's. And from measuring the D's, I can find out what is the lattice parameter of my nanoparticles. So you can see from a single crystal diffraction pattern which has a clear Rangoli kind of a pattern, I am now going into circular patterns. Okay. So whenever you are working on a nanomaterial, if let's say in your BTech you do a project on nanomaterial and you take that nanomaterial to a TEM, transmission electron microscope, and you get a diffraction pattern, the best way to identify from the diffraction pattern whether your material is nanomaterial or not is if you get a ring pattern, you have a nanomaterial. If you do not get a ring pattern, then the grain size is large. Okay? Because inside the selected area aperture, you are not able to cover so many grains. As a result, you may be able to get not a single crystal diffraction pattern, but a number of spots. But it will be some spots on a certain circular region. But it will not be just continuous ring. You get a continuous ring because each of these spots are all very close, that it appears as if it's like a ring. And this is how we can find out from. And now from a nanomaterial, if I go to an amorphous material, like a glass, let's say I take that glass and do a X-ray diffraction. What kind of XRD pattern I get from a glass like that, silicate glass, which is the window glass? If I do a FCC or a BCC, I get peaks. Each peak is a certain HKL, right? But if I take an amorphous material, what kind of a pattern I will get? There are no HKLs here because there are no atomic planes in an amorphous material. Atoms are all randomly arranged. If the atoms are randomly arranged, and then there are no HKL planes for the diffraction to take place, and as a result, you get a broad peak. Okay? Because there is some scattering taking place. There are electrons inside my material. X-ray is being reflected with those electrons, by those electrons. So I should get a broad peak. In fact, people actually even use this broad peak to do certain calculations, because sometimes you do not only get one broad peak, but you also sometimes get another broad peak. And the peak position, if I look at it, and the peak position gives me an idea of what is called first nearest neighbor distance, average first nearest neighbor. In an amorphous material, if I have an atom here, I do not have equally spaced atoms around, because it is not periodic. There is no periodicity. But I have atoms all around it. So I can draw vectors from each of these atoms and find out the distance between in each of the direction. What is the first atom that I am hitting? I can measure the distance and take that average of all these distances. I call it as first nearest neighbor distance. Average first nearest neighbor distance. And similarly, I can talk about average second nearest neighbor distance. And those are the values that I get from these. If I do the same thing with electron diffraction, what do I get? In electron diffraction, instead of peaks like this, because I don't get peaks in electron diffraction, I get what is called a ring, but that ring will be a diffused ring. A certain thickness it will have. I do not know if you have ever seen on a full moon day, you will see some ring around that moon. If you go to the and see on a full moon day, you see this ring, and this ring is because of the diffraction. And diffraction is happening from where? From the dust particles in the sky. And these dust particles are like amorphous atoms in an amorphous matrix, because there is no periodicity there. And because there is no periodicity, the scattering is not a clear Bragg's kind of a scattering, and it's a random scattering, and that is why you get that ring. So this is what you see, and you get a diffused ring, and sometimes you get another second diffused ring also. Again, in the same way, I can talk about first nearest neighbor and second nearest neighbors. So this is how we can talk about what is called bright field imaging, dark field imaging, and diffraction patterns that come from each of these. And the final one point that we can do is, instead of taking either the transmitted spot or the diffracted spot, okay, I said if you choose the transmitted part, you get a bright field. If you choose a diffracted spot, you get a dark field. If I put my objective aperture in such a way that it is covering both the diffracted spot and the transmitted spot, then what happens is the two beams that are coming, the transmitted beam and the diffracted beam, because I am trying to make a composite image coming from all the diffracted beams and the transmitted beams, then there will be a constructive interference between these beams that happens, and that gives me an image which is what is called a phase contrast image. And it is in that phase contrast image I can actually see my atoms. When you want to see, yesterday also possibly I showed you some of the what is atomic resolution images, and if you look at those atomic images, you will actually see the atoms. What I am seeing is not an atom. You should be very clear about this, that what I am seeing is an image of an atom. Why I am able to see an atom like this is because any atom is composed of certain electrons. Between the two atoms, the electron density is low. Okay, if I consider an atom has certain electron density inside it, and between any two electrons, the electron density is low. So as a result, when an electron beam falls onto this, the electrons of the atom scatter this electron beam, and as a result, the scattered beam has certain intensity. But between these two atoms, because the electron density is low, that there is nothing to scatter this electron beam. As a result, the intensity will be low. So what happens is, when I get this phase contrast image, wherever the atoms are, that particular region looks brighter. Wherever the atoms are not there, that region looks darker. And that is how you get a phase contrast image. By considering both the transmitted and the diffracted image, and you will be able to see white spots periodically arranged in a 2D kind of structure. And if you can see that, that is nothing but one of the atomic plane. Depending on my beam is perpendicular to what plane it is. Okay, that plane, how the atoms are arranged in that plane is what I am seeing. Now if I tilt my sample, obviously that pattern changes. You will be able to see another pattern. So this is how one can actually see the atoms, and of course one should be able to have the aberrations corrected in your microscope so that I can actually see this atom. Because if I want to see these atoms, the distance between these two atoms, if it is 2 angstroms, my microscope should have a 2 angstrom resolution. If it does not, I will not be able to see this. They both will look like one single atom, because they look like a fuzzy kind of a picture. So that's the reason why you need to have your microscope to have a very high resolution to be able to see this. This is how we will be able to see different types of contrast, and the contrast in a TEM mostly comes because of diffraction. As I told you, whether it is a bright field or a dark field, okay, the ones that are diffracting will either look bright or look dark, depending on whether you are using a dark field image or a bright field image. This is what is called diffraction contrast. In an optical microscope, what is the concept of contrast? The contrast comes there whether based on what is called whether the topographic differences. For example, if you have a flat region, it gives you bright. If you have a dip, it gives you dark. Right? So the contrast in an optical microscope comes because of hills and valleys inside your sample. That means the roughness on the surface, the topography we call it as. Okay? It is the topography of the surface which decides whether you see bright regions or dark regions. Whereas in a TEM, it is not topography. It is the whether which region is diffracting is the one that matters. In addition to this, there is also another contrast called what is called Z contrast. Z contrast is what we call it as atomic number contrast. For example, if you have a matrix in which there is Al2Cu particles, Al2Cu particles have copper in it. How much copper in Al2Cu? How much copper in Al2Cu? Yes, a little louder. 33.5. 3.5. That is the copper content of your alloy. I am asking you copper content in Al2Cu. What is the carbon content in Fe3C? 6.67, right? How did you get this number? This 6.67, is it atomic percent or weight percent? Weight percent, right? Do you know how people have calculated that? If you want to get the weight percent of carbon in Fe3C, you should take Fe3C has 3 atoms of iron, 1 atom of carbon. So it is 1 into atomic weight of carbon, divided by 3 into atomic weight of iron plus 1 into atomic weight of carbon, will give you this percentage which you just now said, 6.67. Otherwise, if I look at atomic percent wise, Fe3C has 25% carbon. That is the difference between weight percent and atomic percent. Atomic percent means how many atoms are there. There are 4 atoms total, 1 carbon atom among the 4 atoms, 1 by 4, it is 25%. Similarly, if I take Al2Cu, Al2Cu has Al2Cu. So atomic percent wise it is 33% copper. Weight percent wise it is 55% because atomic weight of copper is higher. Now if I look at this particular microstructure with aluminum matrix, mostly aluminum matrix, because alpha is nothing but solid solution of copper in aluminum. And in a age hardened alloy, the solubility of carbon in aluminum at room temperature is less than 5.5%. So it's almost like a pure aluminum. So you have a pure aluminum matrix more or less with Al2Cu particles. And Al2Cu has about 3% of copper, atomic percent copper inside it. So because this atomic number of copper is higher, the scattering that is taking place from Al2Cu by the electrons present in that Al2Cu to this beam that is falling on that is going to be different from the scattering that happens from aluminum. For example, if I have this matrix with a precipitate of Al2Cu, because it has 33% of copper and copper has higher atomic number means what? More number of electrons, right? Atomic number means number of electrons, right? So that means this particular region has more number of electrons than this particular region per unit volume, right? Because aluminum has lower atomic number. So as a result, when the beam falls on this and the beam falls on this, the number of electrons present per unit volume to scatter away the electron beam is going to be smaller in aluminum region when compared to Al2Cu. So as a result, you can get a contrast which is called the Z contrast. And you will see this Z contrast a little later when we are going to talk about SEM also, where we use something called a backscattered image, where you will actually see Z contrast. So these are the 2 types of contrast that we see in an electron microscope. With that, we will close this electron in TEM and jump into the SEM part. As you can see, we have talked about how various microstructural features can be seen in a TEM, and we also talked about what are the various contrast concepts. We also talked about how to analyze a diffraction pattern in a electron diffraction and how is it different from X-ray diffraction. What are the things that we cannot do in an X-ray diffraction which we will be able to do in an electron diffraction is all what we have covered so far. Now we will go to another electron microscopy course, microscopy technique, which is called scanning electron microscopy. As the name suggests, it is also an electron microscope. That means the beam that I am using is an electron beam, and accepting that it is not a transmission electron microscope. That means in a transmission electron microscope, the beam goes through your sample and comes out. Whereas in a scanning electron microscope, it is almost like an optical microscope, where the beam gets reflected from the surface and you see the image of the surface using that. So this is a technique where you have your sample, electron beam is reflected from the surface and you see the image of that. And in a SEM, we usually use only about 20 to 40 kilovolt energy, and as a result, the lambda is going to be not as small as what you see in a TEM, because TEM, most of the TEM start at 100 kV, unless you are going to use them for biological applications. For most of the material science experiments, we use, nowadays nobody uses even 100 kV. So it's almost like 200 kV as a norm. So at 200 kV, what you can get is significantly different from what you get at 20 kV in terms of lambda. Lambda will be much smaller here when compared to this, almost 1 order difference. So at 200 kV, if you are getting 0.02 as a lambda, and you will not be able to get that at this, so you get a higher lambda. Because you are getting a higher lambda, the resolution of an SEM is not as good as a resolution of a TEM. So you cannot use an SEM for seeing atoms, definitely. You will not be able to. However, you correct the aberrations, it is difficult to see atomic images in a SEM, but you can get a lot of other informations in an SEM, some of them which you may not even be able to get it in a TEM, which we will see as we go along. So there are certain disadvantages of SEM. One disadvantage is that it cannot give you very high resolution. The most common resolutions that you can get is on the order of 10 to 20 nanometers is what we have. And some of the best SEMs that are used now, which are called FEG SEMs. I have mentioned about what is a FEG TEM. What is FEG? FEG means what? Yes, what is FEG? I mentioned this in one of the class. I said there are two ways of generating electrons. One is called thermionic emission. What is the second one? Field emission. So FEG is a field emission gun. Okay. Why we call it as a gun? Because it is shooting electrons. And that's why the term gun is used. Okay. So it is the field emission gun, where the electrons are generated by field emission. And if you use a field emission gun, then you can get a better resolution. And people are able to get resolutions even lower than 10 nanometers now. But the best resolution that we talked about in a TEM, aberration corrected TEM, which is 0.5 angstroms, that kind of resolutions you don't get. Maybe the best aberration corrected microscope may give you 1 to 2 nanometers possibly in a SEM. Of course, people are still struggling with that, but I can say the normal SEMs will not be able to show you this kind of resolution. So that is one aspect, but most of the features that I'm interested, for example, if I want to see precipitates, I may not be able to see GP zones, but I will be definitely able to see the theta prime or theta double prime, where they have already grown to a few tens of nanometers or so in an SEM. So particularly if I use FEG SEM. So even nanomaterials that we are talking about nowadays can be seen very easily in this. So what we do in this is that when an electron beam falls on this, it interacts with the electrons present inside the material, and the scattered beam that is coming out is of generally of two types. One is called backscattered, another is called secondary electrons. Backscattered electrons are those which are coming from more or less on the surface of that, and they have not lost their energy much, so they have a lot high energy in it. So most of the time you see backscattered electrons have much higher intensities than secondary electrons. Secondary electrons are coming from a deeper distance after having lost some energy by scattering with the electrons inside the sample. And as a result, backscattered image, we call it as BSE image, backscattered electron image, or secondary electron image. People say SEI, BSEI. So backscattered image is usually used for what is called a Z contrast. For example, if your sample has, as I just now said, some Al2Cu precipitate inside an aluminum matrix, and if my beam is falling on this and getting reflected, the Al2Cu, because it has the higher number of electrons inside it, it scatters my electron beam more than the aluminum which is here. So this particular region will look brighter because more scattering. So I am only collecting the scattered beams only. So this particular region will look brighter when compared to the remaining region. So by looking at that, I will be able to say that yes, here is the region where you have some element which has a higher atomic number. I do not know what element it is, but I will be at least able to say that there are elements inside that particular region which have higher atomic number. What elements they are, to find out, there is another technique called energy dispersive spectroscopy, which we will cover it in one of the next classes, where when we start talking about spectroscopy, we will talk about it. So this particular backscattered image gives you an atomic contrast, atomic number contrast, or people call it as Z contrast, whereas secondary electron image gives you a topography. The information about various depths, because the depth of field of scanning electron microscope is significantly higher even when compared to optical microscope. So you can actually see three-dimensional images, information about your sample. So the depth information can be significantly found out, and as a result, the scanning electron microscopes are mostly used for what is called fractography. What do we mean by fractography? Fractography means when a sample, I take a sample like this, break it into two pieces. Depending on, let's say I apply a tensile load, I pull it, these two, and at some load it fractures. You have a stress strain diagram, you know, you have a yield stress, ultimate tensile stress, and then finally fracture, right? And after the fracture has happened, if I look at the surface of the broken piece and put it into a SEM and see, the nature of the surface can give me a lot of information about what kind of a material this is. Is it a brittle material? Is it a ductile material? Where did the crack nucleate? Where did the crack propagate? How did the crack propagate? All this information can be found out by simply looking at this, because the SEM has a lot of information about the depth, and it can be able to show you the features on the surface. You don't need to polish anything. There is one plus point of SEM, though I said in the beginning that there is a difficulty in the SEM that the resolution is poorer, but one advantage is I can take any broken piece. For example, I can just tear a leaf from a tree and put it into an SEM and see that. I cannot do this with a TEM because I have to do polishing of my samples. I have to bring down the thickness to less than 100 nanometers. Then only I will be able to see, because the electron has to transmit through. If the sample is not thin enough, then the electron beam will not go through. All the electron beam will get absorbed inside the material, because all the electrons inside my material will scatter it away. And so that the beam that is coming out will have almost zero intensity. And this is the reason why we need to specially prepare sample. Yesterday in one of the classes we talked about various techniques to prepare the samples, whereas here you don't need to prepare the sample. You can just take a broken piece and put it, and that can give you a variety of information. For example, if your sample is a ductile sample, usually if you take a rod like this and subject it to tensile loading, a rod will finally fracture like this. Okay, because at some point the cross section starts decreasing at the center, and finally it will break. And this is usually called a cup and cone fracture, if you have heard of this. So it will have something like a small cup, and this is like a cone fracture. And this cup and cone fracture comes because there are a lot of voids generated inside the material, because whenever there is a small crack inside, all these cracks come together, and then the cracks get joined together, and finally the fracture takes place. And these voids will look like kind of equiaxed dimples. Okay, each of the void, if I look at one of the surface, you look as if that voids, if I cut a void, how does it look? It looks like a hemispherical cap. Okay, if there is a hole inside a material, I cut that hole and look at that hole looks like a dish, and this dish is what is called a dimple. So this is called dimpled fracture. So the moment I see dimples, and how do I am able to see dimples? Because the SEM has a lot of depth of field, and the dimples can be seen. If the depth of field is not there, you will not be able to see the depth. It just looks like a flat. And because of this advantage of a high depth of field, you are able to see these depths. And sometimes some of the cracks might have initiated because of the presence of some inclusions inside the material. Many a times, if there are inclusions at the interface between the inclusion and the metal, the crack can be initiated. And you will actually see sometimes certain inclusions sitting inside these dimples. And you can actually find out that these are inclusions by actually putting the electron beam on that particular particle which is sitting there, and finding out the composition of that particle by this technique called EDS, which we are going to talk a little later. So you can prove that yes, this is an inclusion, that whether it is an alumina inclusion or a silica inclusion or whatever it is. All this can be found. Or is it a sulfide? Okay, is it a manganese sulfide? Is it a iron sulfide? All those things can be found out by doing that. This is what is called dimpled fracture. Sometimes you may have material which has, let's say, stainless steel with the grains like this, and the stainless steel has some carbon in it. What happens? This chromium inside the stainless steel reacts with that carbon and then forms a carbide, and as a result, the chromium content near the grain boundaries gets depleted. Have you heard of this? This is called sensitization. And once the chromium content near the grain boundaries, why it is only near the grain boundaries? Because near the grain boundaries, which are more open structures, atoms can easily diffuse. So the carbide formation near the grain boundary is more easy. Carbon and chromium can diffuse easy. So as a result, chromium content comes down. We know that if you want a stainless property, the chromium content has to be minimum 12% to be maintained. Only when the chromium content in any region is higher than 12%, we call it as a stainless steel. Otherwise, we don't. The moment carbon takes away chromium, the chromium content near the grain boundary falls below 12%. Immediately, if there is an acid medium or some corrosive medium around this sample, the grain boundaries get attacked. So the grain boundaries simply get corroded. The grain may not get corroded, the grain boundary gets corroded, and if the grain boundary gets corroded, the material may fracture more easily, because at the grain boundary there is only a corrosion product, which is maybe some iron oxide or something like that is forming. So as a result, if I take such kind of a broken sample and look at that, I will be able to see the grain boundaries very clearly. So this is what is called intergranular fracture. Fracture taking place at the grain boundaries. Similar thing you will also see if you have a steel which is, let's say, a hypereutectoid steel. Can you tell me how does a hypereutectoid steel microstructure look like? Hypereutectoid steel. What will it have at room temperature? Proeutectoid cementite and perlite. Right? Where is this proeutectoid cementite? At the grain boundaries of the austenite. Okay? So if I take this alloy, hypereutectoid, this is austenite, this is austenite plus Fe3C. So when you start with some austenite grains at this temperature, let us say, as I start cooling, the cementite comes out at this austenite grain boundaries. And if I have one more grain, something like this. Right? You have cementite at these grain boundaries. These are all cementite. And now the remaining region gets converted to perlite the moment you come below this. And so you will have perlite colonies with lamellae. Right? This kind of a microstructure you get everywhere. Now this cementite which is there at the grain boundaries is very brittle. Right? Because it's a hard compound. So as a result, the moment a crack initiates inside the material, crack can easily propagate along the grain boundaries. Because if there is a brittle material, that is the advantage of brittle materials or disadvantage of the brittle material. If I can simply, if you have ever a person breaking a glass for making frames or something like that, he will just draw a scratch on it and simply bends it, it breaks. Why? Because the moment crack is initiated, crack can propagate very fast. The energy absorbed propagating the fracture is very small. Propagating the crack is very small in a brittle material. Whereas in a ductile material, there is a lot of energy absorbed. That is the reason why if I look at a stress strain diagram of a ductile material, it may look like this, and a brittle material may just look like this. And the energy under this curve, if I look at it, this will be much larger when compared to a brittle material. So that toughness, we call that as toughness, right? So which is nothing but the area under the curve. That area under the curve will be very small for a brittle material many a times. So that is the reason why we can say this material fractures. When it fractures, because it is fracturing across the grain boundaries, you can call it as an intergranular fracture. So by just looking at the fractured surface in a SEM, you will be able to say, yes, this is a brittle material, ductile material. For example, this was one of the major problems when I do not know whether you were born or not that time. Around 1990, there was a huge crash near Bangalore. An aircraft crashed. Have you ever heard of this crash, which has become very popular those days, and people wanted to know whether this is because of some terrorist attack or because of some normal failure of the aircraft. So the way people wanted to know is they have taken the fractured pieces, the broken pieces of this aircraft and put it into an SEM and looked at the fractured surfaces and found out whether it is by explosion. If it is by explosion, then the crack initiates and propagates very fast. And look at how this crack propagation is from the fractured surface. You will be able to know whether it has happened by explosion or because there are some inclusions inside your, let's say, the aluminum alloy which is used, because of which the crack has initiated. And bother about this crack initiated because there are engineers who are supposed to test every day before a passenger goes into the aircraft. If some engineer did not bother about it much, then obviously there were cracks. And when you fly, when you are flying it, there are stresses. Why there are stresses? Because outside it's all vacuum, inside there is a pressure. So because of these pressures, the material, the crack starts propagating. Whenever you start applying pressure, the crack propagates. So it can fracture, and once there is a fracture at some place, obviously the air inside rushes out, okay, and the whole thing fractures. So this is how people were able to prove that actually it is not because of any terrorist attack and things like that. So this is all possible with a microscope like that. Stop here. Okay, with this we will stop and then continue with the microscopy in the next class.